In a sun-baked border checkpoint in the Southwest, an old trucker named Frank "Red" Dawson was about to lose the only thing that kept him going: his rig. What should have been a routine inspection turned deadly when corrupt cops Miller and Daniels turned their badges into weapons of extortion. Frank Dawson wasn't your typical long-haul driver. For years, he was a Vietnam veteran who had survived firefights in the jungle and 30 years on America's highways, known for never bending to corruption or shortcuts. When Miller's shakedown turned violent and Daniels desecrated Frank's late wife's keepsake, they had no idea they were drawing the attention of two silent figures in the diner across the lot. Chuck Norris and Seagal stepped in. Their calm presence, the opening move of a fight the officers couldn't win. Frank's defiance, backed by two legends, would ignite a chain of consequences stretching far beyond that dusty checkpoint. What began as an old man refusing a bribe would become a battle exposing organized corruption. The quiet border town would never be the same after Norris and Seagal turned one trucker's stand into an all-out war for justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck's engine rumbled like distant thunder as Frank "Red" Dawson downshifted, guiding the massive Peterbilt toward the border checkpoint. Sweat trickled down his weathered face, carving paths through the fine desert dust that had settled on his skin during the 8-hour haul across the Southwest. Through the windshield, heat rippled off the asphalt, distorting the horizon where Mexico met the United States in a jagged line of mountains. The crossing wasn't much to look at: a cluster of low buildings baking under the merciless August sun, flanked by a small diner and a gas station with prices too high for anyone but the desperate. Everything seemed to sag under the weight of the heat. Even the American flag hung limp on its pole, as if it too had surrendered to the elements. Frank checked his watch. 3:17 p.m. If he cleared customs without delay, he'd make Phoenix by nightfall. One hand absently stroked the worn St. Christopher medal that dangled from his rearview mirror. 23 years of long hauls, and the patron saint of travelers hadn't failed him yet. He glanced at the small photo taped beside it. Himself and Sarah, taken back in '74 before the cancer took her. Her smile still made his chest tighten. As Frank eased into the inspection lane, he noticed how empty the crossing was: just a couple of local cars and another semi far ahead. This wasn't the busiest border point, which was precisely why he preferred it. Fewer hassles, usually. Paperwork ready, he muttered to himself, reaching for the folder he kept meticulously organized. Frank had seen too many drivers get delayed over sloppy documentation. After Vietnam and 3 decades on the road, he'd learned the value of being prepared. Through his side mirror, Frank watched 2 uniformed officers emerge from the shade of their station. Something in their unhurried stride made the hairs on his neck bristle. The taller one swaggered more than walked, aviator sunglasses hiding his eyes, while the younger one followed half a step behind, thumbs hooked in his belt loops. They didn't move like men doing a routine job. They moved like men who owned the ground they walked on. Frank rolled down his window, letting in a blast of hot air. "Afternoon, officers," he said, extending his paperwork. The taller officer, Sergeant Miller, according to his nameplate, didn't take the papers immediately. Instead, he removed his sunglasses with deliberate slowness, revealing eyes that reminded Frank of the desert hawks that sometimes followed his truck. Patient predators, waiting for something to die. "That's quite a rig you've got there, old-timer," Miller said, finally taking the documents with 2 fingers, as if they might be contaminated. "Must be worth, what, 80, 90 grand? Even with all the miles on it?" His gaze drifted meaningfully over the truck. "She gets me where I need to go," Frank answered, keeping his voice neutral. Behind Miller, Officer Daniels, young, maybe mid-20s, smirked slightly, glancing between Frank and his superior, like a kid waiting for the punchline of a joke. Miller flipped through Frank's paperwork with exaggerated care. You're hauling furniture parts to Phoenix? Yes, sir. All detailed in the manifest. Routing numbers match the invoice. Everything's in order. Miller's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Seems like there might be some irregularities here. He tapped the papers with one finger. Registration seems problematic. Frank's jaw tightened. His registration was current, and they both knew it. Step out of the vehicle. Please, Mr. Dawson, Miller said, his tone suggesting it wasn't a request. Frank hesitated, then released his seatbelt. As he climbed down from the cab, his knees protested the arthritis had been getting worse lately. He stood as straight as he could, refusing to wince. Sir, my paperwork is in order, he said evenly. I've been driving this route for 15 years. Officer Daniels circled the truck, dragging his hand along the dusty trailer. Pretty old equipment you've got here. Safety inspections up to date? Of course they are, Frank replied, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Miller stepped closer, invading Frank's space with calculated precision. Here's the situation, he said, voice dropping to a confidential murmur. We've got a problem. But problems have solutions, don't they? $500 would help me overlook these irregularities. He smiled, teeth flashing white against his tanned face. Otherwise, we'll need to impound this vehicle for a complete inspection. Could take days, weeks even. Frank felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, contrasting sharply with the heat beating down on his shoulders. This wasn't law enforcement, this was highway robbery with badges. There are no irregularities, Frank said, each word measured. And I don't carry that kind of cash. Miller's smile didn't falter, but something hardened in his eyes. ATM. At the gas station works fine. Officer Daniels will escort you. Frank glanced around the quiet border station. A few locals milled about near the diner, but they kept their eyes averted. They'd seen this scene before. 2 customs officials were busy with the truck ahead, too far to notice or care about what was happening here. I'm not paying you a damn cent, Frank said quietly. Check my paperwork properly. Miller's smile vanished. Maybe you didn't hear me, old man. Your truck isn't going anywhere until I say it does. He nodded to Daniels. Full inspection. Everything out of the trailer, every inch. Daniels grinned and moved toward the trailer's rear doors. You can't do this, Frank protested, stepping after Daniels, but Miller's hand shot out, grabbing his shoulder with painful force. Actually, I can, Miller whispered. And I will. Unless you decide to be reasonable. Frank shrugged off the hand, anger rising in his throat like bile. 23 years on the road, never a bribe, never a shortcut. His rig wasn't just transportation. It was his life, his freedom, the last piece of dignity he'd carved out after coming home from a war that had taken too many of his friends and too many of his nightmares. Get your hands off me, he growled. Miller's expression darkened. Resisting an officer now? That's a serious offense. At the small diner across the lot, 2 men sat at a window booth. One wore a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. His companion, dressed in a dark jacket despite the heat, idly stirred his coffee as both men observed the scene unfolding at the checkpoint. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They'd driven together from El Paso that morning, having wrapped a small charity event for veterans. Their rental car was parked behind the diner, out of sight. They weren't looking for trouble, but they recognized it easily enough. They'd seen it in too many forms across too many borders. Chuck Norris set down his iced tea, eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the older officer grab the trucker's shoulder. Across from him, Steven Seagal's expression remained impassive, but his gaze never left the unfolding confrontation. "Reminds me of those border towns in Laos," Norris said quietly, the first words either had spoken in nearly 20 minutes. Seagal nodded almost imperceptibly. "Power without accountability," he murmured, voice surprisingly soft for a man of his size. "The worst kind." Both men continued watching as Daniels began climbing up to inspect the truck's cargo. The trucker, an older man with the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the elements, stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides. Back at the truck, Frank fought to keep his breathing steady as Daniels made a show of examining the trailer's contents, pulling boxes out and letting them drop carelessly to the ground. "Careful with that cargo," Frank called out. "It's not mine to damage." Miller chuckled. "Concerned about the cargo? You should be more worried about yourself, old-timer." He leaned closer. "Last chance. 500. And you're on your way." Frank looked at his truck, the faded red paint on the cab, the chrome still polished to a mirror shine, despite the vehicle's age. Sarah had called it Big Red the first time she'd seen it, laughing at how proud he'd been to finally own his own rig. Now it was all he had left of the life they'd planned together. "My paperwork is legitimate," Frank said, voice steady despite the fury building inside him. "I've hauled through here a dozen times this year alone. Nothing's changed." "Things change all the time," Miller replied, smile gone entirely now. "For instance, your cooperative attitude has changed, and that changes how we handle this inspection." Daniels jumped down from the trailer, brushing dust from his hands. "Nothing obvious in the first few rows, Sarge. Want me to unload it all?" Miller never took his eyes off Frank. "Every last box. And check under the chassis, too. Who knows what an old Vietnam vet might be smuggling these days." His lip curled. "You boys learned all sorts of tricks over there, didn't you?" The mention of Vietnam hit Frank like a physical blow. Not because it was true he'd never smuggled anything in his life, but because it showed how thoroughly Miller had sized him up. The POW. MIA sticker on his bumper. The army jacket hanging behind the driver's seat. All catalogued and weaponized against him. In the diner, Norris set his empty glass down, with careful precision. Seagal's eyes flickered to his companion's face, noting the slight tightening around his mouth, the only visible sign that something had shifted. "Vietnam vet," Norris said, almost to himself. Seagal's gaze returned to the scene outside. "Like the men at your event yesterday." "Like my brother," Norris corrected softly. Something unspoken passed between the two men, a shared understanding that ran deeper than their differences in style or approach. Both had built careers not just on physical prowess, but on a code that transcended the choreographed fights of their films. Both understood that real strength wasn't about dominating others, but protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Outside, the confrontation continued to escalate. The afternoon heat shimmered across the pavement as Frank watched helplessly while Daniels began methodically emptying his trailer, box by box, onto the dusty ground. Miller stood by, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "This could all stop right now," Miller reminded him, voice dripping with false concern. "Just a quick trip to the ATM." Frank looked at his cargo scattered across the ground, at the sun beating down on exposed furniture components that were meant to be delivered in pristine condition. At 63, with arthritis gnawing at his joints and fuel prices climbing, he couldn't afford the hit to his reputation that damaged goods would bring. But more than that, more than money or practicality, he couldn't stomach giving in to this corruption. "No," he said simply, the word hanging in the hot, still air. Miller's expression hardened. "Have it your way, old man. But your truck isn't leaving this checkpoint today. Maybe not tomorrow either." He gestured to Daniels. "Call for the impound truck. We've got some serious safety violations to document." In the diner, Norris and Seagal exchanged a glance. Neither spoke, but a decision had been made. They'd come to the border crossing for a quiet meal before continuing their drive. They hadn't been looking for trouble. But sometimes, trouble found you anyway. And sometimes, doing nothing was the same as doing wrong. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as Miller's words registered. Impoundment. The word hit him like a physical blow. Without his rig, he was nothing, no cargo, no income, no home on the endless stretches of highway that had become his sanctuary after Sarah died. On what grounds? Frank demanded, heat rising to his face that had nothing to do with the merciless sun. My truck passed inspection in Tucson 3 weeks ago. Every permit's current. Every system's functional. Miller's smile widened, revealing teeth too white and perfect for a border officer's salary. The inspection report doesn't mention this cracked reflector. He tapped the side of the trailer, where a small red reflector had indeed cracked, probably from road debris, or this worn tread. He pointed to a tire that, while legal, showed signs of use. And who knows what else we'll find once we really start looking. Officer Daniels paused in his methodical dismantling of Frank's cargo to glance between the two men. For a moment, something like discomfort flickered across his young face, then it was gone, replaced by a forced smirk as he caught Miller watching him. "We're just doing our job," Daniels added, his voice carrying a slight tremor that betrayed his words. "Your job?" Frank's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "Your job is shaking down drivers who can't afford to fight back. Your job is stealing from working people who are just trying to make an honest living." Miller's hand dropped to his belt, fingers tapping his holstered pistol in a gesture too deliberate to be casual. "Careful, old man. That sounds dangerously close to interfering with an officer in the performance of his duties." Frank felt the trap closing around him. Anger would get him nowhere. Might even land him in a cell alongside his impounded truck. But capitulation wasn't in his nature, not in the jungles of Vietnam, and not here under the unforgiving desert sun. In the diner across the lot, Norris and Seagal continued their silent observation. To casual onlookers, they might have appeared to be nothing more than two middle-aged men taking a break from the road. Norris with his weathered features and steady gaze, Seagal with his impassive expression and deliberate movements. Neither drew attention to themselves. Neither needed to. The waitress approached their table, coffee pot in hand. "Refill, gentlemen?" "No, thank you," Norris replied, his eyes never leaving the scene outside the window. "Something going on out there?" she asked, following his gaze. "Oh, that's just Miller and Daniels doing their thing. Happens a couple times a week." She lowered her voice. "Best not to get involved. Miller's got friends in the sheriff's department. Even the mayor backs off." Seagal looked up at her, his expression unchanged. "How long has this been happening?" The waitress shrugged. "Year, maybe 2. Used to be just commercial drivers. But lately, they've been stopping regular folks too. Especially if they look like they can't fight back." She gestured with her chin toward Frank. "That old guy's gonna lose his truck if he doesn't pay up. Shame. But that's how it works here." After she walked away, Norris and Seagal sat in continued silence. But the atmosphere between them had changed. It was the subtle shift of men moving from observation to decision. Outside, Frank watched helplessly as Daniels continued pulling boxes from the trailer, stacking them haphazardly on the baking pavement. Each container represented another piece of his dwindling livelihood scattered in the dust. "You know, most smart drivers carry cash for situations like this," Miller said, inspecting his manicured fingernails. "Professional courtesy, they call it. I call it extortion." Frank replied, voice low but steady. Miller's casual demeanor slipped for an instant, revealing something ugly beneath. Call it whatever makes you sleep better, old man. But your truck isn't moving until I say so. A local man had stopped to watch the confrontation, cell phone halfway to his ear. Miller noticed him and barked, "Move along! Police business." The man hurriedly pocketed his phone and scurried away. Frank noted how easily the crowd dispersed, how routine this seemed to everyone except him. "How many others?" Frank asked, sudden understanding washing over him. "How many other drivers have you robbed?" Miller stepped closer, using his height to loom over Frank. "It's not robbery when you have a badge, old-timer. It's law enforcement." "It's corruption," Frank said, refusing to back down despite the throb of his bad knee, and the knowledge that he was fighting a losing battle. "And it's cowardice. Picking on people who can't fight back." Miller's face darkened. Big words, from a man about to lose his truck. He nodded to Daniels. "Check his cab. Thoroughly. Tear up the upholstery if you have to." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Wait." Frank stepped toward his truck, but Miller's arm shot out, shoving him back with enough force to make him stumble. Frank caught himself against the trailer, pain flaring through his arthritic hip. "That's assaulting an officer," Miller said, voice dangerously soft. "You really want to add that charge?" Inside the diner, Norris had risen slightly from his seat when he saw the officer shove the older man. He settled back only after seeing the trucker regain his balance, but his eyes had narrowed perceptibly. "Not our business," Seagal said, though his tone suggested he was reminding himself as much as his companion. "No," Norris agreed quietly. "Not yet." Daniels had climbed into Frank's cab and was now rummaging through the sleeping compartment behind the seats. Frank watched, fists clenched in helpless rage, as the young officer pulled out his duffel bag and dumped its contents onto the ground. Clothing, toiletries, and personal items scattered across the dirt. Something small and silver tumbled from the bag, a woman's bracelet with a heart-shaped charm. It had been Sarah's. Frank always kept it with him, a talisman against the loneliness of the road. "Well, what have we here?" Daniels called out, stooping to pick up the bracelet. "Looks like real silver. Stolen goods, maybe?" "That was my wife's," Frank said, voice tight with emotion. "Put it down." Daniels dangled the bracelet from his fingers, taunting. "Nice piece. Probably fetch a decent price." Something in Frank snapped. 23 years of hard work, of honest living, of fighting against an industry that chewed up drivers and spat them out. 3 decades of grief. Of talking to Sarah's photo when the nights got too quiet and the roads too long. All of it crystallized into a single moment of defiance. "I said, put it down," he shouted, moving toward Daniels with surprising speed for a man his age. Miller intercepted him, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. Frank gasped as pain shot through his shoulder. "That's it," Miller hissed in his ear. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer and resisting arrest." "He didn't assault anyone," came a quiet voice from behind them. Miller turned, Frank still in his grip, to find Chuck Norris standing a few yards away. The martial artist hadn't approached aggressively. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, expression calm but resolute. For a moment, Miller didn't seem to register who he was looking at. Then recognition dawned in his eyes, followed immediately by confusion and the first flickers of uncertainty. "This is police business," Miller said, his voice lacking the commanding edge it had carried moments before. Please, step back. I've been watching for 15 minutes, Norris replied, his tone conversational but firm. I haven't seen any police business. Just harassment of a Vietnam veteran. Miller's grip on Frank's arm loosened slightly as his attention split between maintaining control and processing the unexpected intervention. Daniels had frozen in the cab doorway, the silver bracelet still dangling from his fingers, his eyes wide with recognition. Holy shit, Daniels whispered. That's Chuck Norris. And I believe the gentleman asked you to put down his property. Came another voice. Deeper and more measured. Steven Seagal had approached from the other side. His movements unhurried, yet purposeful. He stood with perfect stillness, hands clasped in front of him, dark eyes fixed on Daniels. The young officer swallowed visibly, looking to Miller for guidance. The atmosphere had shifted so suddenly that no one at the checkpoint seemed to know how to respond. A small crowd had begun to gather at a cautious distance. Drawn by the unusual tableau, Miller, to his credit, recovered quickly. Mr. Norris. Mr. Seagal. He acknowledged, forced smile returning. I'm a fan of your films. But with all due respect, this doesn't concern you. This man was resisting a legitimate vehicle inspection. I saw him standing still while you searched his truck without probable cause. Norris countered. Then I saw you put hands on him when he objected to your officer mishandling his personal property. Miller's smile became strained. He was still holding Frank's arm behind his back, creating an increasingly awkward tableau as the seconds stretched on. We have authority to conduct thorough inspections at border crossings. And does that authority include demanding bribes? Seagal asked, his voice so quiet that Miller had to strain to hear it. The color drained from Miller's face. I don't know what this man told you, but we've been watching from the diner, Norris interrupted. We heard everything. The growing crowd of onlookers had begun to murmur among themselves. Someone had raised a phone, recording the confrontation. Miller was losing control of the situation. And he knew it. Officer Daniels, Miller called, voice tight with suppressed rage. Radio for backup. Daniels hesitated, looking from his superior to the two martial artists, then at the small but growing crowd of witnesses. For the first time, the young officer seemed to be considering the consequences of his actions beyond simple obedience to Miller. Sir, Daniels began uncertainly. Maybe we should… Radio. For… backup, Miller repeated through clenched teeth. In that moment of distraction, Frank twisted free from Miller's loosened grip, stumbling backward against his truck. Miller's hand immediately went to his holster. Don't, Norris said simply, taking one step forward. Just one step. But something in his posture, in the absolute certainty of his bearing, made Miller freeze with his hand still on his weapon. The border crossing had gone completely silent. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, the metallic click of Daniels setting down the silver bracelet on the truck's step sounded unnaturally loud. Sarge, Daniels said, voice barely above a whisper. There are too many witnesses. Miller's gaze darted around, taking in the crowd, the recording phones, the two action stars, and the old trucker who stood with his back against his vehicle, rubbing his sore arm but straightening to his full height with newfound resolve. You're making a mistake, Miller said, addressing Norris and Seagal while struggling to maintain his authority. This man was transporting suspicious cargo. We have protocols. What's suspicious cargo? Frank interrupted, finding his voice again. Furniture parts? It's all documented in the manifest you're holding. Seagal stepped closer to the scattered boxes on the ground, kneeling to examine one that had broken open in the rough handling. Wood chair components, he confirmed, holding up a curved piece of finished maple, as stated in the paperwork. The crowd had grown larger. Among them were other truck drivers who had pulled in to see what was happening. Their expressions showed a mixture of surprise, satisfaction, and vindication as they watched the unfolding scene. Miller was losing, had already lost, but pride and anger kept him from accepting it gracefully. "This isn't over," he said, directing his words at Frank, but glaring at Norris and Seagal. "You can't interfere with border security." "We're not interfering with security," Norris replied evenly. "We're witnessing a shakedown. And now, so is everyone else." He gestured to the phones recording the encounter. Miller's jaw worked silently, teeth grinding as he calculated his diminishing options. Finally, with a curt nod to Daniels, he stepped back. "Finish the inspection. By the book." Daniels nodded, relief evident on his face as he closed the truck's cab door and climbed down, careful to give Norris a wide berth. Frank straightened his shirt, dignity returning with each passing moment. He bent slowly, ignoring the protest of his joints, and picked up Sarah's bracelet from where Daniels had placed it. He clutched it tightly for a moment before carefully tucking it into his pocket. "My paperwork is in order," he said, voice stronger now. "I'd like to continue my route." Miller's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. "After a complete inspection," he insisted. "Which you've already conducted," Seagal observed. "Rather thoroughly. From what we witnessed." The sun beat down on the tableau. Frank, standing by his truck, Miller and Daniels rigid with thwarted authority. Norris and Seagal positioned like sentinels, not threatening but immovable. And the crowd of onlookers, growing bolder as they sensed the shift in power. One of the customs officials from the main building had finally noticed the commotion and was approaching with a concerned expression. "What's going on here?" she called out. Miller turned, seeing a potential ally. "Routine inspection that turned confrontational," he began. "They demanded a bribe." Frank cut in, his voice carrying across the lot. $500 to let me pass. When I refused, they started dismantling my cargo and threatened to impound my truck." The customs official looked startled, her gaze moving from the scattered boxes to Miller's face and then to the crowd of witnesses. "He's lying," Miller said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We heard everything," Norris repeated quietly. "So did they." He nodded toward the onlookers with their recording phones. The customs official's expression hardened. "Sergeant Miller. Officer Daniels. I need to speak with you. Now." She turned to Frank. "Sir. Please. Wait here." As she led the two officers toward the main building, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The crowd murmured excitedly, some approaching Frank to offer support or ask questions. Frank turned to Norris and Seagal, who had remained nearby, watchful but unobtrusive. "I don't know how to thank you," he began, voice rough with emotion. Norris shook his head slightly. "No need. You stood your ground first. We just helped. Even the odds." Seagal regarded the scattered boxes. "Let's get your cargo reloaded," he said simply. "You've got a schedule to keep." As the three men began gathering the displaced cargo, others from the crowd stepped forward to help drivers who had faced similar treatment, locals who had witnessed the corruption but been powerless to stop it. Together, they worked to restore order from the chaos Miller had created. Frank worked alongside them, moving more slowly due to his arthritis, but refusing to stop. With each box returned to the trailer, each piece of his dignity restored, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Not just the immediate danger of losing his truck, but the accumulated weight of all the times he'd felt powerless since Sarah's death. Today, at least, the good guys had won. But the confrontation was far from over. The customs official emerged from the main building 20 minutes later, her face set in grim lines. Behind her, Miller and Daniels followed at a distance. Their expressions a study in contrast, Miller's twisted with barely contained fury, Daniels uncertain and vaguely nauseated. By then, Frank's cargo had been nearly restored to order. The boxes repacked with surprising efficiency by the impromptu crew of helpers. Norris and Seagal had worked steadily alongside the others, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it, simply focusing on the task at hand with the same quiet competence they brought to everything they did. "Mr. Dawson," the customs official called, approaching the truck. Her nameplate identified her as J. Ortiz, senior officer. "I'd like to speak with you privately, if possible." Frank nodded, brushing dust from his hands. "Of course." She led him a short distance away, just out of earshot of the others but still within view, a deliberate choice, Frank suspected, to avoid any appearance of further misconduct. "I want to apologize for what happened here today," she began, her voice low but clear. "This is not how we conduct business at this crossing." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. "With all due respect, ma'am." The waitress at the diner seemed to think it happens regularly. Ortiz's mouth tightened. "I've heard rumors, but this is the first time anyone's been willing to come forward. Most drivers just pay or turn back." She glanced over at Miller, who stood rigidly by the main building, watching them. "Unfortunately, without formal complaints, there's been little I could do." "And now?" Frank asked. "Now, we have witnesses. Credible witnesses." Her gaze flickered toward Norris and Seagal, then back to Frank. "But I still need your statement. Are you willing to file a formal complaint?" The question hung in the air between them. Frank knew what she was really asking. A formal complaint meant delays, paperwork, possibly even a court appearance down the road. For a long-haul trucker, time was literally money, and every hour spent not driving meant income lost. More than that, it meant crossing Miller not just today, but permanently, making an enemy of a man who clearly knew how to hold a grudge. Frank looked over at his truck, at the helpers still carefully repacking the last of his cargo, at the two unexpected allies who had stepped forward when no one else would. Then he looked back at Miller, whose eyes burned with the promise of retribution. "Yes," Frank said firmly. "I'll file a complaint. Today." Ortiz nodded, seeming unsurprised by his answer. "Thank you. If you'll come with me, I'll take your statement. I've already contacted my supervisor and the Internal Affairs Division." As Frank followed her toward the main building, he passed close to Miller, who stood with his arms crossed, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man," Miller said, voice barely above a whisper, meant for Frank's ears alone. "You think those movie stars will stick around? They'll be gone by sunset, and you'll still be driving these roads alone." Frank kept walking, not dignifying the threat with a response, but the words burrowed under his skin. Miller was right about one thing: Norris and Seagal would move on. They had their own lives, their own responsibilities, and Frank would still be here, navigating the same routes, potentially crossing paths with Miller again. Inside the customs building, the air conditioning hit Frank like a physical force after hours in the desert heat. Officer Ortiz led him to a small office and offered him a chair and a bottle of water, both of which he accepted gratefully. His knee throbbed, and his shoulder ached where Miller had twisted his arm. "This won't take long," she assured him, setting up a recording device and arranging forms on the desk between them. "Just tell me exactly what happened." From the beginning. Frank recounted the events methodically, starting with his arrival at the checkpoint and proceeding through the escalating confrontation. Ortiz listened attentively, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly letting him speak uninterrupted. And you believe this was not a legitimate inspection but an attempt to extract a bribe? She asked when he had finished. Yes, Frank confirmed. Miller specifically mentioned $500 to overlook irregularities that didn't exist. Ortiz nodded, making a note on her form. And there were witnesses to this demand? Mr. Norris and Mr. Seagal heard it from the diner, and probably half a dozen locals saw what happened afterward. Good. She tapped her pen against the desk. Mr. Dawson, I want to be transparent with you. Officer Miller has been with the department for 15 years. He has connections. This won't be simple. Frank's mouth set in a determined line. Most worthwhile things aren't. Ortiz smiled slightly. No, I suppose they aren't. She pushed a form across the desk. I need your signature here, affirming that your statement is true and complete. Frank signed, his hand steady despite the fatigue seeping into his bones. What happens now? Now, Ortiz said, gathering the papers. We process your crossing legitimately. Your paperwork is indeed in order. And then, Internal Affairs takes over the investigation into Miller and Daniels. Frank nodded, rising from his chair with a wince that he couldn't quite suppress. Thank you. No, Mr. Dawson. Thank you. It takes courage to stand up to corruption. She hesitated. But please, be careful. Miller isn't the type to forget. When Frank emerged from the building 15 minutes later, properly processed and cleared to continue his journey, he was surprised to find Norris and Seagal still present. They stood near his truck, which had been completely reloaded, the cargo secured, and the doors latched. You didn't have to wait, Frank said as he approached them. We wanted to make sure you got through okay, Norris replied. Frank nodded his thanks. Glancing around the checkpoint, Miller and Daniels were nowhere in sight. But their absence did little to ease the knot of tension in his gut. I filed a formal complaint. Seagal's expression remained impassive, but something like approval flickered in his eyes. Good. Norris stepped forward, offering his hand. We're headed to Phoenix ourselves. Mind if we follow you for a while? Just to make sure there's no misunderstanding on the road. The offer caught Frank by surprise. These men had already done more than most, would have certainly more than anyone had done for him in years. That they would extend their intervention, delay their own journey to ensure his safety, stirred something in his chest that he hadn't felt for a long time. Not quite hope, but perhaps its quieter cousin, the recognition that not everyone in the world was content to look the other way. I'd appreciate that, Frank admitted, shaking Norris's hand. His grip was firm, but not showy, the handshake of a man with nothing to prove. As Frank climbed into his cab, muscles protesting after the confrontation, he caught sight of Miller emerging from a side door of the customs building. The sergeant stood watching, sunglasses back in place, face unreadable. But his posture, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides radiated fury. Frank started the engine, the familiar rumble offering a measure of comfort. He adjusted his mirrors, checked his gauges, and prepared to roll out. Through the side mirror, he saw Norris and Seagal walking toward a nondescript rental car parked near the diner. Officer Ortiz appeared at his window. You're clear to go, Mr. Dawson. Drive safely. Frank nodded his thanks, but as he shifted into gear, Miller suddenly pushed past Ortiz, his hand slapping against the door of the truck with enough force to startle both of them. This isn't over, Dawson, Miller hissed, leaning close to the window. You think filing a complaint means anything? I've had complaints before. Nothing sticks, but you'll remember this day. Ortiz grabbed Miller's arm, her expression furious. That's enough. Step back, officer. Miller shook her off, eyes never leaving Frank's face. I know every mile of these highways, every shortcut, every side road. And next time, your Hollywood friends won't be around to save you." Frank felt a chill despite the desert heat. There was something in Miller's eyes that went beyond simple corruption or wounded pride. Something unhinged and dangerous. "Is that a threat, Sergeant?" Frank asked quietly. "It's a promise," Miller replied, voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "Old men like you shouldn't travel alone. Too many accidents on these roads. Too many trucks found abandoned." Before Frank could respond, Ortiz physically inserted herself between them, pushing Miller back. "Sergeant Miller, stand down immediately!" Miller's face contorted with rage, but he took a step back, teeth bared in what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the coldness in his eyes. "Have a safe trip, Dawson." Frank watched him stalk away, heart hammering against his ribs. The threat had been unambiguous, and despite the formal complaint, despite the witnesses, he knew with sudden clarity that Miller wasn't done. Men like that never were. They nursed their grudges, fed them like pets, until the right moment came to unleash them. With hands that weren't quite steady, Frank put the truck in gear and pulled away from the checkpoint. In his mirror, he could see Norris and Seagal's rental car falling in behind him, a reassuring presence. But they wouldn't be with him forever. Eventually, he would be alone again, on roads that suddenly felt a lot less welcoming. The highway stretched before him, a ribbon of asphalt shimmering with heat. Frank tried to focus on the familiar routine, the rhythm of the engine, the weight of the wheel in his hands, the endless horizon pulling him forward. But Miller's words echoed in his mind, poisoning the solitude he had once cherished. Too many accidents on these roads. Too many trucks found abandoned. Frank reached for the radio, needing some noise, any noise to drown out the memory of Miller's voice. As music filled the cab, he noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, he told himself. From anger. From the adrenaline crash after standing his ground. But deep down, Frank knew better. For the first time in years, he was afraid. Not of death, he'd faced that possibility too many times to fear it, but of dying like this, alone on some dusty back road, his truck ransacked, his body left for the desert to claim. No dignity, no purpose. Just another statistic. Another mystery for the highway patrol to half-heartedly investigate before filing it away under unsolved. The road wound through rocky outcroppings, the terrain gradually becoming more rugged as they left the border behind. Frank checked his mirrors compulsively, noting with relief that the rental car remained a steady distance behind him. Its presence was reassuring, but it also underscored a painful truth. He had become the kind of man who needed protection. The years, it seemed, had finally caught up with him. Frank had just rounded a sharp curve when he saw a highway patrol car parked on the shoulder ahead, lights flashing. His stomach knotted. It was too soon after the crossing to be coincidence. Too perfectly positioned to be routine. Miller had made a call. Frank's first instinct was to keep driving, to press the accelerator and hope the patrol car wouldn't follow. But decades of living by the rules, of believing in a system that mostly worked despite its flaws, made that impossible. He was not a man who ran. Not in Vietnam. Not in the decades since. And not today. With a sigh that seemed to come from his very soul, Frank signaled and began to pull over. In his mirror, he saw the rental car slow as well, stopping a short distance behind him. At least he wouldn't face this alone. The patrol officer emerged from his vehicle young, maybe 30, with a neatly trimmed mustache and the overly precise movements of someone relatively new to authority. He approached Frank's window with one hand resting on his holstered weapon, a stance that seemed unnecessarily aggressive for a routine traffic stop. "License and registration," the officer demanded without preamble. Frank complied. Movements deliberate and slow. "Can I ask why I've been stopped, officer?" "Reported brake light malfunction," the patrolman replied, studying Frank's documents with exaggerated thoroughness. "And possible cargo irregularities." The wording was too close to Miller's accusations to be coincidental. Frank felt his jaw tighten. "My brake lights are functional. I checked them this morning. And my cargo was just inspected at the border crossing." The officer's expression remained impassive. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Frank hesitated, weighing his options. Compliance might lead him into the same trap he'd just escaped. Refusal would only escalate the situation. Before he could decide, the sound of car doors opening behind him drew the officer's attention. Norris and Seagal approached unhurriedly, their posture non-threatening but purposeful. The patrolman's eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "Is there a problem here?" Norris asked, his tone conversational but carrying an unmistakable weight. The officer straightened, suddenly looking much younger and less certain. "Routine traffic stop. Nothing to concern yourself with, sir. We just left the border checkpoint," Seagal said, his deep voice carrying across the empty landscape. Mr. Dawson's vehicle was thoroughly inspected there, by Officer Ortiz herself. The patrolman's gaze flickered between them, the confidence in his bearing visibly eroding. "I received a call about potential violations." "From Sergeant Miller, I'm guessing?" Norris said. Not a question, but a statement. A flush crept up the young officer's neck. "I'm not at liberty to discuss. Miller just threatened this man in front of witnesses," Norris continued calmly. "Including a senior customs official. There's an internal affairs investigation opening as we speak." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "You might want to consider whether you want your name connected to that investigation." The officer's expression cycled through confusion, alarm, and finally, caution. He looked down at Frank's license in his hand, then back at the two men standing patiently on the shoulder of the road. "I need to make a call," he said finally, retreating to his patrol car. Frank released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thanks," he said quietly to Norris and Seagal. "Again." Norris shook his head slightly. "Miller works fast. He must have some serious pull to get a highway patrol response this quick. Or serious dirt on someone," Seagal added. They watched as the patrolman spoke animatedly on his radio, occasionally glancing in their direction. After several minutes, he emerged and approached them again, his demeanor markedly different, professional but subdued. "Sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Dawson," he said, handing back the license and registration. "You're free to go. Drive safely." No explanation, no admission of Miller's involvement. Just a retreat thinly veiled as procedure. Frank nodded, accepting the documents without comment. As he turned to climb back into his truck, the patrolman cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, voice lowered, "you might want to stick to the main highways for a while. The back roads, they can be unpredictable." It wasn't quite a warning. Not officially. But the meaning was clear enough. Frank nodded again. A silent acknowledgement of the unspoken communication. The officer returned to his vehicle and pulled away without a backward glance, leaving them alone on the sun-baked shoulder of the highway. "He's right," Norris said, watching the patrol car disappear around a bend. "Miller's not going to let this go." "No," Frank agreed, suddenly feeling every one of his 63 years. "He's not." The three men stood in silence for a moment. the weight of the situation settling over them like the relentless desert sun. Frank had won the immediate battle at the checkpoint, but the war had only just begun. Miller had resources, connections, and most dangerously, a wounded ego. He would be waiting for his opportunity the moment when Frank was alone and vulnerable. "I need to get this cargo to Phoenix," Frank said finally. "It's due tomorrow morning." Seagal nodded. "We'll follow you there." Frank looked between them. These two unexpected allies who had materialized when he needed them most. "I can't ask you to do that. You've already done more than enough." "You didn't ask," Norris pointed out, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We offered." Frank wanted to protest further, to insist that he could handle himself, that he'd been driving these roads alone for decades. But the truth was, he needed them, not just for their physical presence, but for what they represented. A reminder that sometimes, against all odds, justice could prevail. That standing up for what was right wasn't always a losing proposition. "All right," he conceded. "To Phoenix." As they returned to their vehicles, Frank felt something shift inside him, a resurgence of determination that had been slowly eroding over years of solitary travel. Miller had threatened him. Yes. But he had also done something perhaps more significant. He had reminded Frank why the fight mattered in the first place. With newfound resolve, Frank started his engine and pulled back onto the highway, the rental car following at a discreet distance. The road ahead shimmered with heat, a mirage that kept receding as they approached. But for now, at least, he wasn't facing it alone. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the desert in amber and gold. Frank's eyes burned from hours of driving, from the glare of sunlight on asphalt, from the emotional whiplash of the day's events. The road ahead blurred occasionally, forcing him to blink hard to refocus. They had traveled nearly 2 hours without incident. The steady presence of the rental car in his mirrors, providing reassurance he hadn't known he needed. But as daylight began to fade, anxiety grew within him. Night driving was normally his preference, less traffic, cooler temperatures, a certain peace in the darkness. Now, however, the approaching sunset felt ominous, as if the fading light would remove a thin layer of protection. A green sign appeared. "Rest area, 1 mile." Frank activated his turn signal. Decision made before he'd consciously considered it. His body demanded a break, and caution suggested they regroup before nightfall. The rest area was simple, a gravel lot with separate sections for cars and trucks, cinder block restrooms, and a few picnic tables beneath drought-resistant trees. Frank guided his rig into an empty space at the far end. Norris and Seagal pulled in beside him, parking alongside his truck rather than in the designated car area. A small act of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed. Frank climbed down, wincing as his knees protested. He stretched, feeling the pop and crackle of joints that had grown increasingly uncooperative with age. "Everything okay?" Norris asked, as he and Seagal approached. Frank nodded. "Just needed a break before nightfall, and I thought we should talk about what happens when we reach Phoenix." The three made their way to an unoccupied picnic table where they could observe both the parking lot and the highway beyond. "I appreciate what you've both done," Frank began, voice gruff with emotion. "But Phoenix is still hours out, and you've got your own lives to get back to." "You're concerned about what happens after we part ways," Seagal said. "Not a question." Frank nodded. "Miller's not the type to forget. And he's got friends in places that matter." "He's a bully," Norris observed. "Bullies thrive on isolation. They pick targets they think are vulnerable. Alone. And I fit the bill." Frank's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "Old man. Solo driver. No company backing me up. But that's not all you are." Seagal leaned forward. Miller saw only what he wanted to see. Vietnam veteran, Norris said. That means you've faced worse than Miller, and survived. You've got discipline, training, resilience. Frank hadn't thought of himself that way in years. The war was a chapter closed long ago, filed away with memories that served no purpose in his day-to-day existence. That was a lifetime ago, he said, looking down at his weathered hands. I'm just a truck driver now. You're the man who stood his ground against corruption, Seagal countered. When most would have paid the bribe or turned around, that's not just anything. A family at a nearby table gathered their belongings. Children complaining about having to leave. Normal life continuing around them. Oblivious to the gravity of the conversation taking place yards away. Frank watched them go, reminded of how ordinary his existence had been just that morning. So what's the play? He asked, finally. I can't have an escort forever. Sooner or later, I'll be on my own again. And Miller will be waiting. Norris nodded, acknowledging the reality. You've already taken the first step. The formal complaint creates an official record. If anything happens to you now, Miller becomes an immediate suspect. That might not stop him, Frank pointed out. Men like that, when they're backed into a corner, they get desperate. Dangerous. True, Seagal agreed. Which is why you need allies. Not just us. Others who understand what you're facing. Frank frowned. I've been driving solo for decades. Most of my contemporaries have retired or passed on. I don't exactly have a wide social circle. What about other drivers at the company you contract with? Norris asked. Or the businesses you deliver to regularly. Frank considered this. He had acquaintances, certainly dispatchers he spoke with regularly. Loading dock managers who knew him by name. Fellow drivers he encountered at the same stops month after month. Not friends, exactly, but people who might notice if he suddenly disappeared. There are some, he admitted. Not close. But they'd notice if I stopped showing up. That's a start, Norris said. Make those connections stronger. Let people know what happened today. Not dramatically. We don't want to make you sound paranoid, but matter-of-factly. Create witnesses before the fact. And Miller? What about him? Seagal's expression hardened slightly. Men like Miller rely on shadows, on isolation, on the assumption that no one is watching. So we make sure he knows people are watching. We have contacts, Norris explained. In law enforcement, in veterans organizations, people who understand the importance of standing up to corruption. For the first time since the confrontation, Frank felt a glimmer of genuine hope. Not because these men were celebrities, but because they understood something fundamental. That evil thrived in darkness, in isolation, in the belief that good men would do nothing. You'd do that? Frank asked, the question emerging more vulnerable than he'd intended. For a stranger? For a fellow veteran? Norris corrected gently. For a man who did the right thing when it would have been easier to give in. A comfortable silence fell, broken only by distant traffic sounds and desert birds preparing to roost. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows. They would need to move on soon to reach Phoenix before it grew too late. As if sensing his thoughts, Seagal rose. We should continue. Better to arrive while businesses are still open. Frank nodded, reaching for the table's support as he stood. His body felt heavier than usual, the day's stress manifesting as physical fatigue. I never asked, he said suddenly. What brought you two out this way? Seems like quite a coincidence. Norris and Seagal exchanged a glance containing volumes of unspoken communication. Veterans charity event in El Paso, Norris explained simply. We were heading back to Phoenix for a flight tomorrow. Frank accepted the answer, without further question. Whether coincidence or something more profound had placed them at that diner at that particular moment, he was grateful. They returned to their vehicles in companionable silence. As Frank climbed into his cab, he noticed a small silver pickup entering the rest area, moving slowly through the lot before parking near the entrance. Something about its unhurried pace, the way the driver seemed to be surveying the parked vehicles, triggered a warning in his mind. Frank started his engine, but as he shifted into gear, he caught movement in his side mirror. The silver pickup was moving again, following the same exit path they would take. Before he could decide whether to voice his concerns, Norris appeared at his passenger window. Frank leaned across to roll it down. "Silver pickup by the entrance," Norris said without preamble. "Came in right after us. Driver spent more time watching than using the facilities. So he hadn't been imagining things. You think it's connected to Miller? Could be. Either way, we should adjust our approach." Frank nodded. "A plan forming. There's a truck stop about 10 miles ahead. Busier than this place? More people, better lighting." "Good," Norris agreed. "We'll change the formation. You follow us. Let's see if our friend takes the bait." The simplicity of the strategy appealed to Frank. If the pickup was indeed following them, changing positions would force the driver to reveal his intentions to either fall in behind the truck specifically, or to maintain position behind the lead vehicle. "Okay," Frank agreed. "You lead. I'll follow. Let's see what happens." Moments later, they pulled out in a new formation. Sure enough, the silver pickup emerged shortly after, maintaining a distance that was neither conspicuously close nor so far as to risk losing them. The highway stretched before them, an asphalt ribbon disappearing into the gathering dusk. Their three-vehicle caravan moved through the vastness of the desert, connected by an invisible thread of mutual protection and shared purpose. Frank's hands remained steady on the wheel, but his mind raced, considering scenarios, planning responses. The training from Vietnam, dormant for so long, had awakened the hypervigilance, the tactical thinking, the constant assessment of threats and exits. For the first time in decades, he wasn't facing danger alone. And that simple fact changed everything. The convoy maintained a steady pace along the desert highway, headlights cutting through the darkness. Frank checked his mirrors compulsively, finding reassurance in the steady presence of Norris and Seagal's rental car behind him. Way and Parsons led in their SUV, creating a protective buffer that made Frank feel safer than he had in years. They were 40 miles outside Phoenix when Frank noticed the dark SUV that appeared behind Norris and Seagal, maintaining a consistent distance that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. "We've got company," Frank said into the prepaid phone. "Black SUV. Behind your position." "We see it," Norris confirmed, voice calm. "Tinted windows. No front plate. He's keeping his distance, but definitely tracking us." 10 more miles passed intense vigilance. Then, without warning, headlights appeared on a parallel access road. The vehicle, a heavy-duty pickup with oversized tires, accelerated suddenly, cutting directly into the path of Parsons and Way's SUV, forcing them to swerve violently. The lead SUV fishtailed, Way fighting for control. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed he would recover. Then the SUV hit loose gravel on the shoulder and rolled once before coming to rest, 15 yards from the highway. Frank's instinct was to brake, to render aid. But the prepaid phone rang sharply. "Keep moving," came Seagal's voice, controlled but tense. "We'll check on Parsons and Way. Don't stop for anything." Before Frank could protest, the black SUV that had been following them suddenly accelerated, swinging alongside Norris and Seagal's rental car before swerving sharply, attempting to force them off the road. What happened next occurred with such precision that Frank could hardly believe his eyes. The rental car didn't panic brake or swerve wildly as the attackers likely expected. Instead, it maintained perfect control, yielding just enough to avoid impact before executing a textbook defensive driving maneuver. The SUV, surprised by the skillful response, overcompensated. When it swerved again, more aggressively, Norris was ready. The rental car dropped back sharply, causing the SUV to miss its target entirely. In the moment of confusion, the rental car accelerated alongside the SUV before Seagal did something that caused the SUV's front tire to blow out. The effect was catastrophic. At highway speeds, the loss of a front tire sent the SUV into an uncontrollable spin. It careened across both lanes before flipping twice and coming to rest in a crumpled heap on the opposite shoulder. "Keep driving," Norris instructed through the phone. "Way and Parsons are okay, minor injuries only. They've called in local backup. We'll escort you the rest of the way." The attack had been coordinated, professional, not the work of a corrupt small-town cop acting alone. Miller had connections to something bigger, something more dangerous than simple checkpoint extortion. As they approached Phoenix, traffic increased, and Frank felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. They continued through the city to the furniture manufacturing facility where he was to make his delivery. The yard was well lit and surrounded by a security fence. Frank scanned his keycard at the gate, which slid open, allowing both vehicles inside. For the first time since leaving the truck stop, Frank truly relaxed. They had made it. Whatever Miller had planned had failed to stop the delivery. He parked his truck in the unloading bay and shut off the engine. The sudden silence almost deafening. Norris and Seagal approached as Frank climbed down from his cab. The three men stood in the harsh glare of the security lights. A moment of shared accomplishment, passing wordlessly between them. "We made it," Frank said, voice rough with emotion. "We did." Norris nodded. "Way just texted he and Parsons are okay. Minor cuts and bruises. Local police have secured both vehicles. 3 suspects in custody." "3?" Frank frowned. 2 from the SUV. 1 from the pickup that ran way off the road. Seagal explained. "The pickup driver tried to flee on foot but didn't get far." "This is bigger than Miller, isn't it?" Frank asked. He couldn't organize something like this alone. "We think Miller might be part of a larger operation," Norris confirmed. The border checkpoint was just one node in a network. "Bribes, harassment, maybe worse." "Organized crime?" Frank asked. "Or organized corruption?" Seagal replied, his eyes hardening. "Sometimes the line blurs." Frank ran a hand over his face, suddenly feeling every one of his 63 years. What had started as a personal stand had inadvertently exposed something much larger and more dangerous. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now, we document everything," Norris said. "The incident at the checkpoint, Miller's threats, the highway attack. We take it to federal authorities, not local. And in the meantime," Frank gestured to the darkness beyond the fence, "I can't just stop driving. It's my livelihood." "No," Seagal agreed. "But you don't have to drive alone anymore." The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention to the entrance. 2 cars pulled up, a police cruiser with Phoenix PD markings and an unmarked sedan that screamed, "Federal Agent." "These are the good guys," Norris assured him, noticing Frank's tension. "I made some calls while we were driving." From the police cruiser emerged a female officer, Sergeant Rodriguez. From the unmarked car stepped a plainclothes man with watchful eyes. "Mr. Dawson? I'm Sergeant Elena Rodriguez. Phoenix PD. This is Special Agent Thomas Clark with the FBI." "FBI?" Frank questioned. Isn't this excessive for a corrupt border cop? Not when that border cop might be connected to a multi-state corruption and smuggling investigation we've been building for months, Clark replied. Your friends provided some interesting puzzle pieces we've been missing. We've been investigating a pattern, he continued. Harassment and extortion at certain border crossings. Truckers refusing to pay suddenly targeted for inspection. Cited for violations. Sometimes worse. But witnesses disappear or change their stories. Because they're afraid, Frank said, thinking of Miller's threats. Yes, but you're different. You stood your ground, filed a formal complaint. And you have witnesses who can't be easily intimidated. Clark nodded toward Norris and Seagal. We'd like to take your full statement, Rodriguez said. Every detail, from the checkpoint to the highway attack. Frank nodded. Responsibility settling on his shoulders. His stand against Miller had made him a key witness in something much larger than a border shakedown. As they moved toward the vehicles, Frank found himself walking between Norris and Seagal, their presence forming a protective buffer, both physically and emotionally. For a man who had defined himself by independence, it was strange but not unwelcome. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything. No thanks needed, Norris replied. You did the hard part standing your ground when it would have been easier to give in. We just evened the odds, Seagal added simply. Frank glanced back at his truck, the red Peterbilt that had been his constant companion for over 2 decades. For years after Sarah's death, the truck had been his life. It had given him the illusion of freedom, of self-sufficiency. But today had taught him something important. True freedom didn't come from isolation. It came from connection. From standing with others against injustice. Miller had tried to use Frank's solitude against him. Had seen his independence as vulnerability. What he hadn't counted on was that sometimes, standing your ground was all it took to find allies you never knew you had. 3 months later, Frank guided his truck through the familiar approach to the border checkpoint. The desert landscape hadn't changed, but almost everything else had. More officers were visible, official vehicles prominently displayed, and cameras mounted where none had been before. Frank pulled into the inspection lane, window already lowered. A female officer approached, not Ortiz, but someone with the same air of professional competence. Good morning, she greeted. License and registration, please. Frank provided the documents, watching as she reviewed them with appropriate thoroughness. Not the theatrical performance Miller had enacted, but the genuine article. Everything looks in order, Mr. Dawson. Would you mind opening the trailer for a routine inspection? Frank complied, revealing neatly stacked crates of electronic components. The officer conducted a brief but thorough check, her manner efficient and respectful. Things have changed around here, Frank observed as he secured the trailer doors. The officer's expression remained professional. For the better, we hope. There's new management since the irregularities that were uncovered. Frank appreciated her discretion. Irregularities was certainly one way to describe the systematic corruption that had been exposed. The investigation had revealed a network of officers at multiple checkpoints, extorting drivers, particularly owner-operators like himself. More significantly, it had uncovered evidence of worse crimes, selective enforcement, that allowed certain vehicles to pass uninspected, provided the right payments were made. Well, I appreciate the professionalism, Frank said, climbing back into his cab. Safe travels, Mr. Dawson, the officer replied. As Frank pulled away, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had faced this checkpoint again and confirmed what he had hoped. Things really had changed. He guided his truck toward the small diner, parking in the now familiar lot. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind, unlike anything he'd experienced in years. His statement to Agent Clark had been just the beginning. Follow-up interviews, formal depositions, identification of suspects from photo arrays. Throughout it all, Norris and Seagal had remained involved, not hovering, but present when needed. They had connections Frank couldn't have imagined, and had introduced him to networks he hadn't known. Existed veterans organizations offering support, truckers associations focused on combating corruption. Frank had found himself accepted into these communities, his stand against Miller earning him a respect he hadn't sought, but found he valued. Frank climbed down from his cab, wincing as his knees protested. The arthritis hadn't improved, but he had finally seen a doctor about it, something he'd put off for years. Another change he owed, indirectly, to that fateful day. Inside the diner, Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal sat in the same booth they'd occupied 3 months earlier. They spotted Frank simultaneously, acknowledging him with subtle nods. "Right on time," Seagal observed as Frank joined them. "Always am," Frank replied, ordering coffee and pie when the waitress approached. "How was the crossing?" Norris asked. Frank allowed himself a small smile. "Professional. Thorough, but respectful. No hint of the old regime." "Good." Seagal nodded. "The changes seem to be holding." Frank took a sip of coffee. "I saw the news about Miller's sentencing, 15 years. He was the key to bringing down the entire operation," Norris confirmed. "Once the FBI had him in custody, it was just a matter of time before he started talking." Miller's fall had been spectacular. The highway attack had been his desperate attempt to silence a witness, accelerating his downfall. With 3 attackers in custody, all willing to reduce their sentences by cooperating, Miller's connection to organized smuggling operations had been quickly exposed. Daniels had fared better, turning state's evidence early and demonstrating genuine remorse. His youth and cooperation had earned him a reduced sentence, 5 years, with possibility of parole after 2. "And the bigger operation?" Frank asked. "The smuggling ring?" "Dismantled," Seagal replied. Satisfaction in his eyes, if not his expression. 28 arrests across 3 states. Asset seizures in the millions. One of the largest corruption cases in border enforcement history. Frank shook his head. "All because I wouldn't pay a $500 bribe. All because you stood your ground when it would have been easier not to," Norris corrected. "Sometimes that's all it takes to start something bigger. I've been thinking about Sarah a lot," Frank said, the words emerging before he'd fully formulated the thought. "About what she'd make of all this. She always said I was too stubborn for my own good. But she also taught me that some things are worth being stubborn about. After she died, I lost sight of that. Got too focused on just getting through each day, each mile. Grief does that," Norris observed quietly. "Narrows your focus to survival. But these past few months, it's like waking up from a long sleep, remembering who I used to be." The 3 men sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in his own thoughts. "I've been offered a job," Frank said finally, "with the Truckers Against Trafficking organization. Training drivers to recognize signs of human smuggling along the border routes." "Are you considering it?" Seagal asked. "More than considering," Frank admitted. "I'm going to take it. Keep driving part-time, but spend the rest teaching others what to look for, how to respond safely." He paused. "How to stand their ground when it matters." Norris smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features. "Sounds like a perfect fit." "It feels right," Frank agreed. "Like maybe all this happened for a reason." As they prepared to depart, a sense of closure settled over Frank. Not the ending of a chapter, but the beginning of a new one, where his decades of solitary travel served a purpose beyond simple survival. where his stubborn integrity found expression in something larger than himself. "Will I see you two again?" Frank asked as they stood beside his truck. "Count on it," Norris said simply. "We have a veterans event in Tucson next month," Seagal added. "Perhaps we could meet afterward." "I'd like that," Frank replied, surprised by how much he meant it. These men had become something he hadn't had in years. Friends. They shook hands, the gesture carrying more weight than words could express. Frank climbed into his truck, the familiar cab welcoming him with the embrace of well-worn leather. He started the engine, its rumble resonating through his body like a heartbeat. For 23 years, this truck had been his constant companion, his shelter, his escape from grief. Now, it would become something else, a platform for change, a vehicle not just for transporting cargo but for making a difference. Frank adjusted his mirrors, checking the secure positioning of Sarah's bracelet on the dashboard, no longer hidden but displayed prominently. A reminder of all that had been, and all that could be. He put the truck in gear and pulled onto the highway, heading toward Tucson with the desert stretching endlessly around him. The road ahead was long, as it always had been, but for the first time in years, it felt less like an escape route and more like a path forward. "Well, old girl," he murmured to Sarah's memory. "Looks like your stubborn old man still has some fight left in him after all." The highway stretched before him, a ribbon of possibility cutting through the unforgiving landscape. Frank drove on, no longer alone, even in his solitude, carrying with him the quiet certainty that sometimes the most powerful force in the world was simply the courage to stand your ground and the wisdom to recognize when others stood with you. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.